Ok. Bom dia, pessoal. Nós acho que já estamos um pouco atrasados, temos que começar essa sessão. Essa sessão vai tratar de macroeconomia do desenvolvimento e distribuição de renda. É um tema central na ordem que nós estamos assistindo no mundo. Estamos num período de transição ou de crise da hegemonia do sistema capitalista central. É a segunda crise que nós assistimos depois da constituição do capitalismo, a crise do Império Britânico e a desordem que foi entre a Primeira e a Segunda Guerra Mundial. Agora estamos assistindo, com licença dos meus dois companheiros aqui americanos, um canadense inglês, um franco-canadense, a crise do sistema do capitalismo central, a emergência de novos polos de dominação econômica, a emergência de novas formas de moeda, a emergência da moeda digital com lastro de tesouros, tá certo que é uma coisa nova. Então é isso que nós vamos assistir, qual é a visão deles sobre a macroeconomia global, sobre o sistema monetário e financeiro internacional, sobre a emergência de novas moedas e quais os impactos disso sobre o mundo em geral, sobre a periferia, sobre a América Latina e sobre o Brasil. Shortly, we have Professor Gary Dimsky. He is a full professor at Leeds University. He has a big number of publications on macroeconomics, post-Keynesian economics, income distribution, most of them focused on Latin America and in developing countries. And Professor Louis-Jean Rochon, he is a full professor at Laurentian University in Canada. He is also the editor-in-chief of the Review of Political Economy, and he is a director of Monetary Policy Institute. And he also has a very large number of publications in macroeconomics, post-Keynesian economics, monetary system, and financial system. So I don't want to spend more time giving this introduction. Immediately, I pass the word to Gary Dimsky.
Obrigado, senhor. Prazer estar aqui de novo em momento de crise. I'm going to speak in English, and thank you, everyone, for the kindness and the arrangements to be here together again. Most important that we talk at this time of crisis. Let's go. I'm going to do like a jazz drummer and control two at once.
Okay.
Or not. Here's our map. I'll try to spend about 30 minutes and not go over. We're going to go through first the situation of global financial macro power and marginality. We're then going to get into the storm as it's coming and the different kinds of polarizations in Latin America and in North America that make this a self-reinforcing trap. We'll then bring in perspectives of some of those trying to think about the planetary boundaries problem, ecological problem, focusing on Kate Raworth's book, and then we'll talk about responses, two that are out there and one that that focuses on the agenda that we need to have. Let's see, that goes, okay, part one. Oops. Excellent. Global architecture of power and finance. In the late 70s is where we begin. Rampaging inflation and recession, something like we have now globally. This rocked the US and Europe, and this led to banking deregulation and financial market big bangs all over, Japan, Europe, etc. This set in motion this neoliberal macro-financial dynamic. It's an era defined on the one hand by crises, too big to fail institutional rescues in the global north, and by a succession of repeated financial crises and enterprise destruction in the global south. The US became a safe haven since the 1980s. That's a discussion that gets into the so-called shortage of safe assets, which is a ridiculous literature that now dominates discussion for many neoclassical economists. The Fed and its international lender of last resort, plus the massive U.S. economy, are the anchors of this positional power for the United States that has enabled the global financial dominance of U.S. mega bank-centered shadow banking. This positionality allows the U.S. to be the global consumer of last resort, systematically living beyond its means for 40 years, and it's historically contingent and now maybe beginning to crumble, and requires, however, that the U.S. itself sustainably maintain this system's rules. Now, some of you, here's first of all, a picture. This is just a picture to show you the growth of the financial system. It says 100% of GDP, and it's just ridiculous the way that this system has worked. When you think about the global elite, keep in mind that this elite basically is mostly generating rents off of this financial system. It's growing much faster than anything else in GDP. Not surprising that we have the 1% problem. Okay, then we can go to another sort of picture, and just to say that here's the mega banks, and it's just a picture that shows the size of the largest mega bank in each country, and what you see of the major countries, what you see is that the U.S. is at the top, and actually there's been a decline in the size of the British and German banks. Nobody can compete with Wall Street because nobody has the Federal Reserve except the U.S. Okay, now, let's go to the rules. Maybe you've seen the movie Fight Club. And, the Fight Club this is basically a way of thinking about this global pyramid system that is now in place in finance. The only rule is that there are no rules, except actually there are. And the crises expose them as follows. First, foreign investors are first in line, domestic borrowers are last in line. That's a rule. Secondly, the Federal Reserve must always intervene immediately to avoid any breakdown in financial circulation, not just crisis. This is the development since the global meltdown in 2008, et cetera, that now the Federal Reserve is in the financial markets every day, underlying the repo markets, et cetera. Rule number 3, cash flows across the borders of financial hub nations have no citizenship, require no passport, and cannot be blocked. You can see that actually, I'm not going to talk about Ukraine today, but you can see that rules number 3 begins to erode the sort of soundness of this little system. And in fact, rule number 1 is also violated once you start picking out which foreign capital is viable and which is not. Now, the global returns of U.S. liabilities support globalization, lead to financial predation and speculation and all of this, and basically leads in the global south to secular stagnation, to current account surpluses that have turned into deficits since the Great Crisis. Global investors, and I have an asterisk there, chase asset bubbles, widening macroeconomic imbalances. Now let's just keep in mind what Dimsky used to say about speculation. Speculation is when you buy to sell, not buy to hold. He used to like to say that, but it's true. Now, here's the story. You may have seen this if you follow. I think we had something in the CJE that just came out, but check it out. This is for the global areas as a whole. The sort of darkest black, solid black line is emerging market and developing economies as a whole globally. You'll notice that they start in surplus and then they dip down into deficit after the crisis. And notice that the advanced economies, the others, basically go into surplus. Now, I have many versions of this picture and investigation, but the point is this. There's a global structural imbalance such that developing countries as a whole are in systematic deficit. They must borrow to sustain their positionality. It's not behavioral, it's structural. Okay, we've said this at the United Nations and so on, and for what it's worth. And let me just do one more page here for this part, which is that the consequence of this is that there's double hubs of global power. This actually is a theme that Nicole and I worked up in the CJE piece that's just come out. Basically, you have a mega bank-dominated financial system backed by the hegemony of the US dollar, and then there's the global factory. And as, you know, remember Samir Amin, back in the late 70s, was already talking about how you have to see the world upside down, and you have to have an Asian-centered view. And I remember a debate with Jamie Galbraith, and we were debating where's the center of the capitalist system today. And despite what, despite the discussion this morning, Jamie said it's China. And so I don't think we can debate that now. But basically, so we have these extremes. There's a financial core, the U.S. itself, the safe haven of the U.S. dollar in a world of financial crises, and the mega banks are able to underwrite their global risk, earn fees, and exchange zero-sum bets in firms that are too big to manage. It's a game, it's a system, it's all underwritten. The other extreme is the manufacturing core, and basically East Asia, especially China. They're interdependent. The U.S. is dependent on East Asia's exports, and East Asia relies on the U.S. consumer and investment markets. Now, there's much to be said there, but basically, there's a map that I like. You can check it out on I think it's called the Global Economist, I think it's called the Visible Economist, and they show you reserves by nation, and it's just interesting. The reserves as a percentage of GDP or in general, much higher in these countries that are outside of those hubs. So that means that's the extensive peripheral margin. These member nations have risks along both dimensions. They're not financially strong, and they also have these financial fragilities because of that, and they have fragilities of provisioning. Of course, this leads us to part two, which is, let me get this organized here, which is the coming global storm. And this takes us right into thinking about the Latin American financial trap. Nations at or near both poles, right, are immune from speculative attack, but nations in the middle are exposed. The globalized financial firms are using speculative financial attacks to take gains whenever they can. This is the carry trade, right? And this is other forms of speculation. This is Bolsonaro coming in and all the global investors being so happy, and then coming in now, oh, he's an idiot, let's pull out. But that's all a game of basically you ride the bubble, right? You ride the bubble. Who's going to be in? You're going to get in first, get out first, make your money, and it's zero sum. That's the way that game is played, and it continues every day. Look at the leveraged loan market. Now, nations can avoid this by acquiring defensive power. It's a power to be left alone, basically. You can either impose inward capital controls so that foreign capital can only be used productively. That's a whole discussion. We have to go back to Pelosi and Lula, round one, and what did or did not happen about all of that here in Brazil. But basically, they can also build up, to acquire defensive power, a big stock of foreign reserves to ward off speculation. That's what's happened. Nations then overborrow to protect their policy space, even when they have negative current accounts. This is what is true in literally every country in Latin America. You do what you got to do. So Latin America is trapped in a peripheral position along both financial and industrial dimensions. Its nations remain dependent, of course, on the export of commodities. This has been the tragedy of Brazil in this century, is the give back after some gains in manufacturing and producing capacity. So what results, of course, is ever widening extremes of wealth and poverty, ever increasing financialization, an angry and frustrated voting public, increasing social violence. So that's where we are. Here's just one picture of this is a collective picture for Latin America as a whole. Reserve assets on the left-hand axis, that's the one that's going up. And meanwhile, the current account is going down. I cut a picture that shows you the net investment position of Latin America by categories. And what it shows there is that, yes, you see the rise in assets. That's defensive. Stiglitz has a big critique of this. It's like, that's waste. But come on, Joe, that's also defense. And then the same thing shows that the net investment position, these countries you're borrowing to basically offset something even while you are not making a surplus on current account. We know that in Brazil it's complicated for various structural reasons, but I'll leave that there. Now let's just go to the global north for a minute. Provisioning crises and instability in developing economies, first of all, industries and politics have generated continuing flows of economic migrants to advanced economies. This is issue number one in Europe, Brexit, Britain, the US, all of that. Governments, therefore, cannot reassure their embittered citizens as their policy space is being squeezed and extend human services to all. They can't keep guest workers out of the country, or if they do, prices rise. They can't harvest their crops, as in Europe, as in England right now, and they cannot supply then their labor-intensive sectors with low-wage disposable labor. These are all the contradictions of capitalism, all bundled into a kind of policy nexus and political nexus that's fierce with anger and frustration. This encourages the rise of nationalist, anti-foreigner political movements across the global north. Opportunistic leaders bring ghosts out of the closet. Now, I'm going to spare you my interlude from Unicampi, where I featured many images of the marches of the white nationalists and quasi-Nazis and Ku Klux Klan people, because we don't have time today, but let's just imagine you're seeing these people then attacking the capital of their own country. What is that? And actually, that might be the 2024 election, so stay tuned, sports fans. Now, those in subaltern positions in this stratification structure are forced to relive histories of racial, ethnic violence, exploitation, oppression. This political dynamic, of course, blocks any real response to climate change or enhanced human provisioning, the SDGs. To this emergency situation, we now add war, and I'm not going to talk about war today. But let's go to basically the next part of, okay, we're now in the global crisis part, and one very astute way of characterizing this global crisis was proposed by Kate Raworth, Oxford political economist, and she talks about how there's a donut, and if you've never seen this, it's a really clever book. That the idea is that you have the planetary boundaries on the outside, that's that circle, ecological ceiling, you cannot exceed those, but then you don't want to go too far below, because she sets up this imagination of social foundation, what people need. It's a nice picture, right, because it brings in the climate change aspect, and then it brings in the social development goals aspect in one kind of way of looking at it, and then talks about there's human deprivation or planetary degradation. Very clever and useful analysis. And she gets into, what does she want from economics? She's very Polanyi. Forget the free market, think embedded market. And strange though it sounds, that means there's no such thing as deregulation, only re-regulation that embeds the market in a different set of political, legal, and cultural rules, simply shifting who bears the risks and costs and who reaps the gains of change. So here's another circular model she's got. Now, what does she want from economics? She appreciates Keynes, anti-depression. She critiques the Hayekian view. She complains, as we would imagine, that demand-led growth, stripped of anything else, doesn't invisibilizes ecological costs. We know that that's true. And she has a critique of the efficient market hypothesis and supports Minsky. Okay. And she writes, far from playing a supportive role to the productive economy, finance has come to dominate it. A small financial elite controls the public good of money creation and profits handsomely from it, destabilizing the wider economy. And then she says, it is time to turn this upside-down scenario the right way up and redesign finance so it flows in the service of the economy and society. Now, in the spirit of gospel church in the U.S., we can only say amen to that. Now, with that, let's go to part 3. which is basically, we're going to look at two options that have been proposed. The one that has been featured by the power brokers in the global economy, the G20 and the people that get together and the IPCC and all of that, we know that there's been some efforts globally to work up what are the goals. That we have the SDGs. There's talk about a global Green New Deal and all of that. And it's also true that the companies most at risk, both in terms of social development goals and the climate change, have least fiscal capacity, least policy space. So credible plans have to figure out a way to do cross-border finance for SDGs, et cetera. And so there's the figure that the people at UNCTAD came up with, $3 trillion per year. Now, that's a lot of money, but we have a $93 trillion global economy. Still a lot of money. Now, in the Paris Accords, 2015, the nations made pledges, but it doesn't add up to $3 trillion. So you need something more. And there's where the climate change conference in Glasgow really focused on blended finance. Now, that's where private sector funding is provided. The private sector makes the financing, the funding, so to speak, and to use Asimacopoulos distinction. And but this financing is underwritten by public sector guarantees. So that's how you get it. The private sector makes the loans, and then it's all underwritten. It's like the old Fannie Mae. This blended finance system requires a lot of stuff. For example, you have to have fundable projects. You have to use securitization to attract the investors. You got to get sovereign nations or multilateral development banks to de-risk. They even propose having the World Bank no longer make loans, but also like a bank like say the IADB no longer make loans, just underwrite. And then you have to get private sector banks to play. Basically, I've been part of some conversations at the UN about this, and some people who really tried to push this agenda, and it's not working. They've only got about 81 billion, if you count the right way so far short of 3 trillion. The Wall Street bankers, they want it fast, they want it homogeneous, they don't want to work, they just want to make their fees and then play games. So not working. The second one we want to talk about is the kind of special thing that's happened with the COVID pandemic, which is the attention to special drawing rights. Now, as you know, special drawing rights are reserve assets that supplement the IMF member countries' foreign exchange reserves. They can be exchanged for dollars, euros, renminbi, yen, pounds, in transactions with central banks in the UN and the IMF. They're not usable in private markets. Now, they were conceived by UNCTAD, actually, the people that we work with a little bit, in the early 1960s to create a multilaterally managed reserve asset. European nations were imbalanced. They were trying to keep the Bretton Woods system going at that point, and so they tried to use these things to work out their balances with trusted friends in the global north and to facilitate real transfers and so on. So it kind of added on the idea of being available for development finance, but it's limited because basically, as of 1967, as this thing really was being fleshed out, it was linked, the SDR facility was linked to the quota system for the fund. Basically, you can only get SDRs according to how much you pay in to the IMF. So it's limited, and that means that the big players get most of the money, and of course, they don't need the money. You can see that there's a recent calculation of who's used SDRs, and advanced countries only 13%, developing countries 47%, and low-income countries 86%. It doesn't surprise us. Now, there's a debate about what to do. And this debate basically, as three alternatives have been put forward, of course, one by the G20. They're always going to have an expert panel. There's not going to be anybody with a hint of heterodoxy anywhere near any of those expert panels. That's just the way the game is played. I mean, we can kind of get back at them by working with people in the UN, but we're not going to be at that G20 table. And so one is take your unused SDR allocations and give them through the IMF to the developing countries that need it. Okay. Secondly, let's have a trust that expands eligibility for vulnerable middle-income countries. Keep in mind, when you're looking at middle-income and lower-income countries around the world, the lower-income countries, as they define it, basically only have access to concessionary financing. They're not in the game. Middle-income countries like Brazil are in the game, and so you can kind of play that reflected there. And then thirdly, let's use leveraged lending. Let's allow the SDRs to be used to enhance the capital of development banks, and they can then take that and make more loans for these purposes. But all these proposals have real drawbacks. They're just repurposing existing SDRs, and they come with policy conditionalities. They remove the conditionality removes the basic character of what an SDR is supposed to be. It's no longer a money, it's now like a debt. And basically, they are, the number is just not going to get you to $3 trillion. Now, UNCTAD's proposed an alternative. The idea is to, this is a brief thing here, that you can check out the Trade and Development Report from 2021, where there's a vision laid out. And the idea is to expand it, have new types and expanded volumes of SDRs, more regular allocations, de-link it from the IMF quota system, and you can do good things with that. I'll leave it there because it's obvious you can do good things. Now let's go to basically the role of economics in the leaderless world. Let's go to basically where we are now. Sovereign debt, okay, so first, is that possible? Can we have a rethinking of the IMF's charter? Can we have a rethinking at the global level? Well, here's something that was published several days ago in the Financial Times. I just highlighted in red a couple of things. It's small. Look at the title. It's astonishing. Sovereign debt architecture is messy and here to stay. Deal with it. The fact that it's a rich guy who is former U.S. Treasury official and IMF representative responsible for international monetary and financial affairs. He's now U.S. chair of UMFIF, which, by the way, is the think tank for these global financial sectors. Now, somebody from that background who says deal with it, that's a guy who didn't have enough of a five-fisted sandwich when he was a boy in the schoolyard, because, you don't get to be a sissy and tell people to deal with it when you're sitting in that position of power and nobody can touch you, right? So it's just, the Financial Times, really? Okay, look at this guy's article too. We'll just touch it for a minute. The current, I'm going to go to the second paragraph. The current architecture is a messy hodgepodge, but market practitioners shouldn't expect major changes and focus instead on the improvements that realistically can be made. And then that next one, he just talks about this global bankruptcy regime, which Guzman and myself and others were proposing in UNCTAD in November 2018, and basically says, we don't want that. The U.S. voted no, by the way, so did Europe, and so on, as you can imagine. And just the last couple of things there. A global bankruptcy regime is a non-starter for further reasons, including possible politicization of decision-making, horrors, and that the United States would not likely concede the sovereignty of U.S. courts. Did we ask you, boyfriend? And in core areas in a supranational body, nor would others. The guy doesn't, he need to teach that guy a lesson. He's forgetting the Fight Club rules. They're systematically breaking Fight Club rule number 3 right now, and their day is ending. If you read Tooze's book on the financial crisis, you will see that they barely, even with the power of the Fed, they barely saved the system. Now, we need global transfers. We're going to go here from global down to regional. Just 3 pictures. This is a picture that just shows you that food supply is...
Excuse me. The pic you are looking is different from that. Okay.
There you go. Sorry. Thank you. Food supply globally is like the other thing. There's not enough food in some places. There's enough food in other places. Just a picture from a recent blog post. And that food, when it's made, also has imbalances that ramify otherwise. This is in terms of water production. This, in the journal called Water, there was a water footprint calculation. Where it's red, it's not sustainable. Too much water to get the food you need. And you can see that even areas that are proudly trade positive have real problems. So we have these kind of problems globally. Now the thing is, it's not impossible. Here's 3 pictures of Brazil in a story by Simone Alfonso da Silva that talks about the regional inequalities and how they've changed in municipality human development index over time. And you can see that Brazil got a lot better with the government since 2000. I'll leave that there because you know what that is. These are efforts to deal with what Furtado and Conceição Tavares call a structural malformation. Now, just to say that there's also a problem that continues. The problems continue. Let's skip this one. Now, let's go back to Rayworth for a minute. And just to say that Rayworth's analysis recognizes power, but doesn't really think about how it deals with structural malformations. And so, she recognizes that power is important, but she doesn't explicitly address the political economic processes that give us that. Now, I'm going to go a little bit here to it. Let's do her planetary limits and human limits problematic, but let's just throw a couple of countries there just for fun. So we have like the United States mostly outside the planetary limits. The dark blue there would be like the marginalized population in the United States below it. And, we can play with different countries to show that essentially the point here is that you got to deal with national borders. National borders go through macroeconomies. Macroeconomies have balances. If you've seen me talk here before, you know that I'm a broken record always talking about borders matter, cross-border relations are fundamental, space matters, and basically, we have this problem where the financial system is actually setting up for itself that red line. That 1%, those people, they live out there, and they're basically sucking surplus from people who are falling off of the inside green line. That's how that system works right now. Now, we're just going to say a couple of things here more, and then I'll wrap it up. And just to say, the post-crisis literature on global financial cycles will have you believe that nothing can be done. Latin America has a subordinate place. That's obvious. Leave that there. The system we have reinforces global financial fragility and imposes stagnation on people throughout the world. The support pillars remain in place, i.e. the Fed, now struggling and under critique, even as the political foundations of that global order give way. Mr. Sobel, that guy, tells us that there is still no alternative. Yeah, okay, we need global action, but we need global leadership, and we don't have any global leadership. I would note that obviously a Lula presidency would help at this stage of this real world that we live in. So we got to move ahead, and because, if we're going to create the otro mundo es posible, if you remember those, it seems like 1,000,000 years ago, right? That basically we need to figure out something. So I got 2 pages here, and I'll be done, and I'll be a couple minutes over, and apologies. Basically, what does economics going to have to do to be future fit? Okay, just here's an agenda. We got to prioritize models that connect the macro layer with the global layer and with the meso and micro layers as well. Secondly, we have to prioritize thinking that integrates multiple social and community dimensions in our models as economists. Thirdly, we need dialogues with environmental scientists, engineers, scientists, so as to encourage innovations and assess their 3-dimensional systematic impacts: economic, environment, human. Fourthly, we have to work in integrated multidisciplinary teams to generate sustainable innovations in production and consumption technologies that can be scaled and used by the socially excluded as well as the elites. And this leads to the last points. That means working directly with marginalized people, regions, and countries, building capacities, encouraging innovations, and more circular living. That we also then, in that frame, need to be in there working with policymakers and governments that are delivering human and infrastructure services. Help them design ways to be more circular. Help them design formats and forms for greenlining funding and bring it in where it's needed. Seventh, we have to rethink the purposes of and control over global financial firms. We have to support rebuilding socially responsive financing channels such as public development banks, credit unions, cooperatives, and so on. And finally, and I'm speaking here at a conference organized by CEDEPLAR, we have to sustain and renew pluralist hubs whose faculty challenge economic models that imagine decentralized markets without state guidance or democratic input can solve human problems. Now, I want to say one thing, and I apologize, the following. That is that the first time I spoke in Diamantina was 2008. I was first in CEDEPLAR 2003. There's a new generation of leadership. And I remember talking to some of the older generation when I first came, and they were worrying about whether the young professors would understand the need to step forward and take a leadership role. You have. I could not be more proud. And you young ones that are coming up, you might be an undergrad, you might be a postgrad, your turn will come. You have to defend the institutions that are at the base of this agenda that we need to try to get to that otro mundo, which we hope could be possible. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. Many thanks for your presentation, your control on time. And please, Professor Jean-Louis, you have the word.
Thank you very much. I just want to begin by saying one thing. Let's not use the word sissy again. No, it's no joke. It's homophobic. It's demeaning to gay men like myself who were beaten up when I was 10 and called a sissy. It's demeaning to women because it associates feminine characteristics with women, meaning women are the weaker sex and men are the stronger sex. So let's avoid the word sissy from now on. Lots of words in the English language to express the same expression. Okay, my talk today. Thank you for that. My talk today is on inflation, interest rates, and income distribution. There's a great quote from Voltaire which says, everything is great when your life is going great. Okay? And so before I begin, I just want to plug in a few things. Familiar with Roch, I'm guessing, a journal I created in 2011. Now the editor-in-chief of Rope. But there's a new journal coming up called Advances in Economics Education at Elgars, which will focus on education, how to teach, what to teach, and how to move forward with a pluralist approach to education. Also, I just want to mention a book series that's coming out with a number of books on monetary policy and a variety of topics. And each book will deal with central banking, monetary policy, and income distribution, and the future of money. One book in particular on gender, Clara Brink here has an article coming up in the book, which promises to be a groundbreaking. And so we're busy with a number of books, 4 of them coming out now, one coming out in January by Fernando Ferreira and De Pola, and a number of other books. So one on financial fragility and one on shadow banking coming. So it's going to be sort of a variety of a very heterodox approach to central banking and trying to deal with a number of important groundbreaking topics. And there's also the Policy Institute. If you're interested in monetary policy, you want to write a blog, please contact me. Okay, let's get to the main show. So I want to talk about how monetary policy should be seen first and foremost from the perspective of income distribution. And there's 3 underlying elements to what I want to talk. First, like I said, monetary policy is about income distribution foremost. The second thing is inflation is always about conflicting claims. The issue that there's some demand-driven inflation, it's a very small component of overall demand, of overall inflation, but it is the major source of central bank policy, as we know. And even in a country like Brazil with a pass-through effects because of exchange rates, we have to see inflation as conflicting claims. And finally, there are weaknesses in the fine-tuning. Now, I started doing research about 20 years ago, and this quote by Marc Lavoie, who's my mentor, is what really sort of got me into this monetary policy and income distribution issue. Marc writes, "It then becomes clear that monetary policy should not so much be designed to control the level of activity, so therefore rejecting fine-tuning, but rather to find the level of interest rates that will be proper in the economy from a distribution point of view." Right? Interest rate is an income distributive variable. The aim of such a policy should be to minimize conflict over the income share, conflicting claims, in the hope of simultaneously keeping inflation low and activity high. Okay? Good. And so if you look at monetary policy from the perspective of income distribution, it brings up the issue of social conflict, the fact that monetary policy is rooted in class conflict.
They could close our lights.
And therefore, there's a built-in class bias to monetary policy. Then if you go a step further, you can certainly look at the gender bias of monetary policy. And, just for goodwill, I added the carbon bias to monetary policy. Now, a number of these more mainstream institutions, IMF, central banks, are discussing these issues, certainly, but they reach very different conclusions than post-Keynesians, and I will deal with that at the end of the presentation. So here, from a post-Keynesian perspective, there's the income distributive channel. There's a credit channel, and there's all these channels, and they all essentially go through the demand side. But here, from a distinct income distributive channel, we can argue that if you divide a monetary policy between interest rate policy and quantitative easing, which has been certainly at the heart of central banking since the crisis, well, you have here the change in interest rates can have a direct effect and an indirect effect on income distribution. And the direct effect is the income channel is divided into two impacts. The direct effect, can't really see that well. The direct effect essentially is seeing the interest rate directly as a revenue to bondholders and asset holders. So usually central bankers will see interest rate as a cost of borrowing, cost of investing, cost of etc. But there's the other side of the coin, which is the revenue side. As interest rates go up, it leads to increased revenues to bondholders. This is what John Smithen called the ultimate revenge of the rentiers. So from a monetary perspective, it is a shift towards a shift of income shares towards the rentier class. Second, the indirect channel is sort of your standard examination, incremental changes in interest rates, if last long enough, may lead to disruptions in labor market, wages, and then a decline in the wage share. I'll argue in a second that recent research that I'm doing now shows that there's actually a connection between these two elements. The wealth channel, of course, low interest rates without proper regulations. This is an important sentence, leads to increases in wealth. So from that, I will argue that low interest rates are never a source of asset bubbles. What is the source of the bubble is the fact that there's a lack of regulations. Okay? And so let's be careful before we jump and conclude that, oh, low interest rates are bad because they destabilize, they lead to bubbles. But let's put that into the context of neoliberal policies and the lack of. And then finally, quantitative easing, you have your wealth effect there. And so this is essentially what I argued here, which is the definition of the direct channel, the indirect channel, as I argue here. And, you know, I want to say that, you know, actually, I got a quote later, I'll say it in a second. And then the wealth effect, okay, this is what I explain in the quantitative easing. I just want to spend a few slides on quantitative easing, which is from a theoretical point of view, based on two core ideas. The first is the purchase of long-run assets will generally lower the the rate of interest on these long-term assets. And this is what Lavoie and Fieberger called the Keynesian view. And so this is the argument that, you know, to lower long-term rates of interest, central banks will step in and purchase a number of assets and lower the interest rates on those assets. Just as an aside, Randy Ray has argued in a wonderful, wonderful paper that I don't think was ever published except as a working paper at the Levy Institute. He argues that you don't need to go through that. The central bank can simply announce what the level of interest rate is on those long-term assets, and the markets should gravitate towards those rates just like they do with the short-term rates. And then secondly, what they call the monetarist view is that what these assets do is they give liquidity to banks. And so during the financial crisis, the problem was interpreted as the reason the banks were not lending, right, because of standard money multiplier models, is the fact that they had a lack of liquidity. So let's give them liquidity and they'll be able to lend. Well, this is the money multiplier model, which many post-Keynesians reject. And in fact, many central bankers are starting to argue against this standard neoclassical monetarist views. Two quotes, the Bernanke quote, which supports the first core idea, and a second quote that goes to support the second type of idea. So quantitative easing, from my perspective, was just sort of a monetarist approach to banking. Now, this said, it had other sort of, you know, consequences. But from a theoretical perspective, this is how they saw quantitative easing acting. So, based on these two arguments, what quantitative easing did not do is, you know, it did not lead to increased spending, increased investment. Well, we know why, you know. Lower interest rate, you know, investments are rather insensitive to interest rates, especially at low levels. And so these are a couple of quotes. This is the famous Bank of England paper that a lot of people quote. This is a quote by Epstein. There's only mixed evidence that this program contributed to increases in lending by the banks in the economy. But what it did do, and now this is sort of, you know, I think becoming a consensus shared by most, even in the mainstream. They are recognizing that quantitative easing had massive wealth distributed effects. And I think that this is why central banks, after the crisis, started getting interested in monetary policy and income distribution. It was because there's really nothing from a mainstream perspective before the crisis on this topic. So it's a very recent topic for central banks, and I think it was because of quantitative easing and its evident impact on wealth distribution. So Mario and the first, so quite standard conclusion by now. But it just goes to show that central bank policy does have income distributive effects. Why did central banks adopt QE? I don't want to get into it, but too much. But, standard monetary policy was not working. Pushing interest rates to the lower bound was not working in reviving the economy. And so they had a crisis of relevance. Central banks had to prove that they were still relevant in the game, especially in a context of monetary policy dominance. They are seen as the only game in town, that there are no alternatives, and therefore central banks had somehow to do something to prove that they still had some influence. And so this is certainly a wonderful quote by Mark in his 2014, the first edition book. It's a desperate attempt by monetary authorities and some economists still adhering to monetarism to demonstrate that monetary policy is always effective. This is what I called Hail Mary economics. So for those who don't know what Hail Mary is, I'm sure Gary can tell you what Hail Mary is. It's a football, it's a football game where at the end of the game, let's just put it that way, you're desperate, you're losing, and you just do the take a chance on a wild, I don't even know the words, the vocabulary in sports, but you just, adopt the wildest possible game strategy. And if it works, you win the game. If it doesn't, you lose. So that's essentially what Hail Mary is. And, we know why investment don't respond well to low interest rates, right? And if, you don't want to believe a post-Keynesian, you can go straight to the central bank, Sharp and Schwer's, New York Federal Reserve. A large body of empirical research offers mixed evidence, at best, that low interest rates effects on investment. Anyways, it says that, note to self to use bigger fonts next time. But essentially it's saying that investments are unresponsive to incremental changes to interest rates. Joan Robinson in 1943 said the same thing. It's a wonderful pamphlet that she published. It's a talk that she gave to labor leaders and labor unions, in which she says, in general, in a slump, there is not a lack of finance, but poor prospects for profit. And she says, you can take the horse to water, but you essentially can't make it drink. Okay. So measuring the impact of monetary policy on income distribution, this is the work I've been doing for the better part of the last 10 years. And in a series of papers with Mark Setterfield, we defined the Pasinetti interest rate rule, which is based on the work of Pasinetti, Marc Lavoie, Mario Seccareccia. And the Pasinetti index is a parking it rule where the rate of interest is equal to the growth rate of labor productivity. In other words, it preserves the existing distribution of income. It leaves unchanged the distribution of income between interest and non-interest income groups, regardless of lending and borrowing activities. A quote by Pasinetti, all individuals, when they engage in debt-credit relations, should obtain at any time an amount of purchasing power that is constant in terms of labor. So from that, Here is, so if the Pazinetti index is positive, it means that there is a shift of income towards the rentier class. So the share of rent goes up, share of wages goes down. So the Pazinetti rule takes into consideration the class conflict root of monetary policy. And see, starting in 1980, you've had the blue line is a traditional Pazinetti one, as I argued, and you have a shift towards the rentier class. And so for the better part of 1980 to about the financial crisis in 2007, monetary policy was largely a good thing for rentiers. The amended or augmented or labor command Pazinetti index, instead of using growth rate of productivity, we're using actually growth rate of wages. And since wages have not kept up with productivity gains, that's why the red line is above the blue line in most cases. And then it shows that from a monetary policy perspective, it was the distributive effect was even worse than previously thought. And we repeated this for many countries, and you see something like that. And what you get is you get this sort of general humpback for most countries studied for about the same period of time, which shows that, you know, across the world, monetary policy in different countries has largely favored rentiers. Okay. Now what we're doing here is we've regressed the Pazinetti index on the horizontal axis with unemployment on the top. And what this means is if the Pazinetti index is growing, what it shows is that there's a transfer of income towards rentier class, a fall in the wage share, and therefore we anticipate an increase on unemployment, and this is what we got for France, for Canada, and for the United States. Okay? And what this shows is that there's an interrelation between the direct and the indirect transmission mechanism of monetary policy. And so we are presenting the more econometric results of this at a conference in April in Naples on central banking, monetary policy, and income distribution. But it's very interesting that there is a positive relationship between Pazinetti index and unemployment. And so what I conclude with Mario Secareccia is that monetary policy is essentially rooted, is essentially an incomes policy. It's an incomes policy for the rentier. And this means it's really an income policy of fear. It's essentially the central bank saying, if you don't behave, because don't forget the central bank thinks inflation is caused by demand, excess wage demands in particular. So if you guys don't behave, if workers don't behave, and this leads to inflation, we're going to raise interest rates. And then that's going to you up. Right? And, well, if you don't believe me, just look at what Powell said just a couple of days ago in Wyoming at Jackson Hole. Pain is coming. Right. Look at what the governor of the Bank of Canada, Tiff Macklem, said early August. Don't build inflation into longer-term contracts. Don't build that into wage contracts. It is going to take some time, but you can be confident inflation will come down. So he's saying, if you demand high wages, inflation won't come down and we'll keep pushing interest rates up. And the same was said by Andrew Bailey, the Bank of England, when he said, show some restraint. Okay? So we have to, in conclusion, we have to sort of Oh, no, not conclusion here. So, like I said, there is, since the financial crisis, a number of central banks looking into this relationship. However, while I'm very happy that they are arguing that there are income distributive effects to monetary policy, they are also constrained by a core fundamental or sacrosanct idea of monetary policy, that it is neutral in the long run. And quite predictably, what do they argue? Well, they argue, okay, so they're saying, yep, there's an income distributive effects, but what they argue is that they're modest, they're small, and they're short-lived. They are a side effect of sound finance, sound policy. And because they're small, because they're modest, and because they're short-lived, guess what? You can ignore them. And this is what you get, this is what central bankers are saying. Central banks should ignore income distribution in setting interest rates because they're small, modest, and short-lived. Future research. So at the Monetary Policy Institute, we have a number of projects going on. One question is this relationship between monetary policy and income distribution emphasized or exacerbated by financialized economies? And if so, what? Well, we can probably think about, we can probably figure that out. But we need empirical result to show that. And what are the transmission mechanisms that are hyperactive in a financialized economy? So are we talking about regime-dependent or regime-specific effects? And finally, this is the paper that we're writing, a time-varying VAR analysis of the macroeconomic impact. Now, the econometrics is not being done by me. I'm reading the paper and I understand all about what's being said about these words that I've never heard of. But Pedro and Silvio are quite good at econometrics. But what we are showing, our initial conclusions, is that, so what we're doing is we're sort of regressing the Pazinetti index on growth and on wage share and unemployment. And what we show is that through simulations is, so it has the predictable negative effect on growth, but after a certain period, growth comes back to trend, but that the impact on unemployment and the wage share are long-lasting, which is a complete opposite conclusion to the mainstream. And so this is it, but I do want to say that this conference in April at the Bank of Italy is one that I'm organizing with the Bank of Italy, and these are data guys and women. And so they're looking at what the data is saying, and I'm hoping that there'll be quite a number of, there's going to be IMF people there and ECB people, and I'm hoping a lot of post-Keynesians. And I'm hoping that there'll be a dialogue of sorts, especially, and the reason I'm doing this econometric models is I had approached the Bank of England to do a similar conference, which they did. But they never invited me, and I reached them. I said, well, this was my idea. Why aren't you inviting me? And they literally said, we don't understand what you do. Where's your DSGE model? Where's your empirics? We don't understand. And I think that's a failure of the British education system if you can't understand a bunch of words put together. But I learned my lesson and I said, okay, we're going to come back with a sophisticated model that you will understand and hopefully have a dialogue with. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We are late, but you are very precise in your time. And I will give a short open for the floor, but first of all, Jim want to give a short explanation.
Yeah, I just want to, I apologize to Louis-Philippe. You were correct that the word was offensive. Didn't occur to me, but it also illustrates that things that are part of everyday vocabulary, which of course, in this case, come from my childhood, have to be reinterpreted. So thank you for the reset.
I've got my own lessons to learn, because when you said exactly what you say, I've got into a lot of problems with feminists who have accused me of falling back on these old instinctive ideas, and we all have to learn to grow and to have a pro-feminist, pro-gay, I don't know what to say, agenda in our vocabulary.
Ok. And, nós vamos dar very rápida abertura para o público, se quiser uma ou duas manifestações very rápidas. Short questions, one or two questions for the public, for the floor.
Hi, thank you, Gary. Thank you, Rochon. I have a question for...
I knew it.
For
I knew it.
Could you go just a little bit further on the Pazinetta index and on the both relationships that you just said? Thank you.
Thank you. So the Pazinetti index, when I did those papers with Mark, I read a lot of literature, and I found that there was something to be said about, it was really a quest of, if not the Taylor rule, then what? And then I fell into the literature by Luigi Pazinetti, and I found it very interesting. And so the Pazinetti index is essentially, or the Pazinetti rule is when the real rate of interest is equal to labor productivity growth. And in that sense, the income of rentiers and the income of workers are going up at the same time, so that no one is made worse off. So if central banks set the long-term, when the long-term rate is equal to labor productivity growth, that's when you have sort of income peace between those two groups. And so we've developed that index and argue that when the index is positive, it means that, the revenue towards rentiers is greater than the revenue of growth of wages. And so it's a shift towards the rentier class.
Thank you. One more question, shortly, because we are very... Uma questão mais rapidamente, porque nós estamos sem tempo já.
Thank you again. But, Louis, I don't think I quite understand, but you have said that quantitative easing has effects on income distribution. And we saw to the...
More on wealth distribution, but yeah.
Yes, but the quantitative easing has reduced the gap between the gains of the rentiers and the wages.
That's not what the empirical evidence is showing. And in fact, a lot of the mainstream people have argued that quantitative easing, some have called it a reverse Robin Hood effect. Virtually all the papers that I've read so far have shown that it has exacerbated the wealth inequalities.
But when we look to the Pazinetti index that you show, it has coming down when in the years when the quantitative easing has going on.
Yes.
So.
Yes. So the Pazinetti index is about income distribution from interest rates between rentiers and workers, and quantitative easing is about the wealth distribution. When central banks go in and they buy a number of assets, which pushes up that value. So, there's a lot of, from that perspective, there's a lot of stuff happening, and we always have to sort of net everything out, and we don't do that.
Okay.
Could I?
We have to close because we are very late. But Gary wants to give one more short question.
One more short answer.
And we have to
about
close.
the quantitative easing. Think about the trends that you saw, the consequences of macro austerity policy in the global north. That's an indirect effect. That's all part of a package of these. And the broader point that Louis-Philippe is making, and I am too, is we have to look systemically and not just individually. So it's important, and you see this in your listing. We have to really break these things down piece by piece to understand what's going on. No index is going to give us everything, just like no model will.
Yeah.
So it's good. The thing really fits together nicely.
Okay.
All right, thank you.
So I have to close because we are very late. Eu gostaria de discutir o papel da moeda digital e o deslocamento do papel do dólar, mas faço isso na hora do almoço. Eu não sou macroeconomista, mas tenho essa curiosidade. I want to discuss the role of the digital currency in the position of the dollar and IMF and the central banks. Thank you. You are closed. I have lunchtime now.